Part 2. That evening, Lucas couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in his chest. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear the smallest sounds in the distance. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, the image of the cattle field haunting him. The circle burned into the grass, the hum in the air. His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was Ethan. "Have you heard anything strange tonight?" Ethan asked, his voice low and urgent. Lucas furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "There's something going on. I don't know if it's related, but people are saying they're hearing voices, whispering, like someone's in their house, but they don't see anyone." "Whispering? Are you sure?" Lucas asked, trying to make sense of it. "I'm telling you," Ethan insisted. "I've gotten calls from 2 different people already, people who live way out of town. They've been hearing things, but when they go to check, there's no one there." "Could be a prank," Lucas said, though even as he said it, he didn't believe his own words. "It doesn't feel like a prank," Ethan replied. "I don't know. Just be careful tonight. If you hear anything, don't go out to check. Stay inside, okay?" "Yeah, I'll keep an ear out." After hanging up, Lucas lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The house felt unusually quiet, and the strange feeling from earlier hadn't gone away. He listened intently, but all he could hear were the sounds of the town settling for the night. The faint creaking of his house, the distant hum of a passing car, the rustle of trees in the wind. But then he heard it. A soft whisper. It came from somewhere outside his window, a low murmur that seemed to crawl into his ears like smoke. Lucas shot up, heart pounding. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, like someone was speaking to him. The voice was close, too close. He jumped to his feet, heart racing. He grabbed his flashlight from the nightstand and headed to the window, but as he reached it, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the window latch, but then he remembered Ethan's warning. Stay inside. Reluctantly, Lucas backed away from the window, but just as he did, a figure moved in the shadows outside. A tall, dark shape that seemed to linger for a moment before vanishing into the trees. Lucas's heart thudded in his chest. He grabbed his phone and texted Ethan. "Did you see something outside?" No response. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it, if it had all just been his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The hum returned, faint but persistent, like a low-frequency vibration deep in the earth. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Lucas's hands trembled as he turned off the lights and climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around himself. The night was far from over, and somehow he felt that it was only just beginning. The whispers were still there, lingering at the edges of his thoughts. He tried to block them out, but they kept creeping back. And with them came the feeling that he wasn't alone. Somewhere, just beyond the walls of his home, something was waiting. The morning light crept in through the blinds, but the unease from the previous night hadn't faded. Lucas barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind had kept him on edge. He reached for his phone, desperate for a sense of normalcy. There was a message from Ethan. "Sorry, phone died last night. Everything okay?" Lucas hesitated, his thumbs hovering over the screen. How could he explain the figure he saw, the whispers he heard, without sounding paranoid? He settled on, "I'm fine. Heard something weird, though. Let's talk later." He dragged himself out of bed and decided to check on the rest of the house. The kitchen was quiet, sunlight pouring through the windows. But when he stepped outside, he noticed something off. The dirt path leading to his house was covered in faint indentations. Footprints. They weren't his. They were too large, and the shape was odd, almost elongated, with toes that seemed unnaturally sharp. "Morning, Lucas." He jumped, turning to see Mrs. Caldwell, his elderly neighbor, standing on the edge of her porch. She was wearing her usual apron, holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables. "Didn't mean to startle you," she said with a smile. "You're up early today." "Yeah," Lucas said, forcing a smile. "Rough night." She nodded knowingly. "I heard a lot of strange noises last night. The coyotes must be active again." Lucas glanced back at the tracks. Those weren't coyote prints. He opened his mouth to say something, but Mrs. Caldwell continued before he could speak. "Be careful if you're out late. It's not safe to wander too far, especially with those lights people keep talking about. Makes the animals act strange." Lucas frowned. What lights? Mrs. Caldwell tilted her head. Oh, just stories folks around here have been spreading. Strange lights in the woods late at night. Don't think too much of it. It's probably just kids with flashlights. Lucas forced a laugh, but his mind was already racing. He thanked her and walked back inside, locking the door behind him. The day passed uneventfully, but the strange tracks weighed heavily on his mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He closed all the curtains and double-checked the locks on the doors. Around midnight, the hum returned. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was loud, like a swarm of bees trapped inside his head. Lucas pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. And then, through the curtains, he saw it. A soft, pulsing light glowing in the forest beyond his backyard. It flickered and moved, almost like it was alive. Lucas's heart raced. He grabbed his phone and called Ethan. Lucas, what's wrong? Ethan answered, his voice groggy. They're back, Lucas whispered. The lights, I can see them. They're in the woods. Ethan's tone immediately shifted. Don't go outside. Just stay where you are. I'm coming over. Lucas hung up and paced the room, his eyes darting between the curtained windows. The light grew brighter, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. Suddenly, Rex began growling, low and guttural, his hackles raised as he stared at the back door. Quiet, boy, Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. The growling stopped, replaced by a sharp whimper, and then the back door handle began to turn. Lucas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The back door handle twisted slowly, deliberate in its movement. His mind raced. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. Rex stood rigid by Lucas's side, teeth bared but strangely silent now, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The handle stopped moving, but a soft tapping began instead. It was rhythmic and oddly precise, as though whatever was on the other side was testing the boundaries, gauging its options. Ethan, where are you? Lucas muttered to himself, clutching his phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. He dialed Ethan again, but it went straight to voicemail. The tapping ceased. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of silence. Lucas strained to listen, heart pounding in his ears. And then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the glass pane of the back door. Lucas's knees nearly gave out. He backed away, his eyes glued to the door. The thought of opening it felt like madness, but the idea of standing there, frozen, seemed worse. Who's there? He managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Instead, the knocking resumed, louder this time, almost urgent. Rex barked once, a short, startled sound, and then backed away, whimpering again. The dog rarely acted afraid, and seeing him cower only deepened Lucas's fear. The knocking stopped again, and then Lucas saw it. A shadow moved past the small window on the door. It wasn't human. The outline was tall, unnervingly so, with elongated limbs that seemed to sway unnaturally as it moved. Lucas stumbled backward, nearly dropping the knife. He reached for the curtains on the nearest window and peeked out. The glowing light was closer now, pulsating and shimmering just beyond the tree line. And in its glow, he could see more shapes. Silhouettes, at least 4 of them, standing motionless in the woods. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he nearly screamed. It was Ethan. Ethan! Lucas whispered harshly, answering immediately. Lucas, I'm almost there. What's going on? Ethan's voice was laced with urgency. They're here, Lucas said, his voice trembling. The lights, the figures, something tried to open the back door. Don't open it. Don't go near it. I'm pulling into your street now. Just hang on. Lucas barely heard him. His focus was on the shadow that moved back toward the door. This time, it lingered by the window. He could make out more details now. The elongated arms, the way its head tilted unnaturally to the side as though it were listening. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his chest. The figure stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. Lucas's relief was short-lived as a sudden loud thud reverberated through the house. It wasn't the back door. It came from the roof. Lucas, are you there? Ethan shouted over the phone. They're on the roof, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan cursed. Stay inside. Don't move. I'm parking now. A flash of headlights swept through the living room as Ethan's car pulled into the driveway. Lucas bolted for the front door, flinging it open just as Ethan jumped out of his car. Get inside, now, Lucas shouted. But as Ethan reached the porch, a sharp, high-pitched sound pierced the air. It was unlike anything Lucas had ever heard, a mix of static and a shrill scream. Both men clutched their ears, stumbling backward. Lucas looked up and saw it, a massive, glowing object hovering silently above the house. The hum was deafening now, and the light from the object bathed everything in an otherworldly glow. Ethan grabbed Lucas by the arm. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, the light grew impossibly bright, blinding them both. Lucas and Ethan shielded their eyes as the piercing light from the craft above illuminated the entire area, turning night into an eerie, artificial day. The sound that accompanied the light, a low, thrumming hum, vibrated through their bones, making their knees weak. Rex barked wildly from inside the house, his frantic yelps mixing with the unnerving noise. "What is that?" Lucas shouted, his voice barely audible over the pulsating hum. "I don't know," Ethan yelled back, his eyes fixed on the glowing object hovering silently above the trees. Its edges shimmered with an otherworldly brilliance, and it seemed almost alive, pulsating gently like a heartbeat. The light shifted, casting strange, long shadows across the yard. Ethan grabbed Lucas by the arm and pulled him toward the car. "We need to leave. Now." But just as they reached the vehicle, the light dimmed slightly, the hum tapering off until it became a faint vibration. Everything fell still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Lucas turned to look back at the house. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his vision, a faint silhouette just at the edge of the forest. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways that defied human anatomy. "Do you see that?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. Ethan followed his gaze, his face pale. "Let's get out of here." The figure didn't move closer. Instead, it remained partially obscured by the trees, watching, its vague outline illuminated by the craft's faint glow. Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of being observed, as though every move he made was being cataloged and analyzed. Ethan fumbled with the car keys, unlocking the doors with shaky hands. They climbed in, slamming the doors shut. As Ethan started the car, the hum from the craft above grew louder again, and the light intensified. It wasn't directed at them, but it illuminated the figure in the woods for the briefest of moments. Lucas gasped as the creature's shape became clearer. Its elongated limbs and featureless head seemed like something out of a nightmare. "Drive!" Lucas urged, his voice tight with fear. Ethan hit the gas, and the car sped down the driveway, kicking up dust as they tore away from the house. Neither of them spoke as the light faded behind them. When they finally reached the main road, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. The glow from the craft was still visible, but it wasn't following them. Instead, it seemed to hover above their house, as if it had claimed the property as its own. "They're not chasing us," Ethan said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and confusion. Lucas nodded, though his chest still felt tight. "But they're not leaving either." The silence in the car was heavy as they drove toward town, leaving the eerie light and the strange figure behind. But both of them knew that whatever had come to their house wasn't finished. Not yet. Lucas and Ethan parked outside a small diner in town, their nerves frayed and their minds racing with questions. Inside, the faint hum of casual conversation and clinking silverware contrasted starkly with the surreal events they had just escaped. They chose a corner booth, away from prying eyes, and sat in tense silence for a moment. "What just happened back there?" Lucas finally asked, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might invite unwanted attention. Ethan shook his head, running his hands through his hair. "I don't know. I've read about UFOs, strange lights, and unexplained sightings, but that was something else." Rex lay under the table, his usual playful energy replaced with an uneasy stillness. The dog occasionally let out soft whimpers, his ears twitching at every sound. "I think we're being watched," Lucas muttered, glancing out the diner's window at the empty street outside. "By who?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Or what?" Lucas corrected. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice further. "That thing in the woods, it wasn't human, Ethan. And it wasn't just watching us. It felt like it was studying us." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden loud thump outside made them both jump. They turned their heads sharply toward the window, their hearts pounding. A garbage can had tipped over, spilling its contents onto the pavement. A stray cat darted out from behind it, its tail puffed up as it disappeared into the alley. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, laughing nervously. We're both on edge. It's just a cat. Lucas nodded, though the unease in his chest didn't dissipate. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. What if they're still at the house? Ethan paused, his jaw tightening. Then we need to go back and figure out what's going on. Lucas's eyes widened in disbelief. Go back? Are you serious? After what we just saw? We can't just run away, Ethan argued, his voice firm. This is our home, Lucas, and if we leave, we might never know what's really happening. Rex let out a low growl, drawing their attention. His gaze was fixed on the diner's entrance, where the door had just swung open. A tall man in a dark coat entered, his face partially obscured by a hat. He didn't look at them as he made his way to the counter, but there was something about his presence that felt off. Let's get out of here, Lucas whispered, sliding out of the booth. Ethan hesitated but followed, throwing a few bills on the table to cover their untouched coffee. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the street eerily quiet. As they walked back to their car, the feeling of being watched returned. Lucas glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing unusual, just the dim glow of streetlights and the occasional flicker of neon signs. Let's not go back to the house tonight, Lucas said as they climbed into the car. Ethan nodded reluctantly. We'll figure it out tomorrow. But as they drove away, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow might be too late. The following morning, Lucas and Ethan sat in the motel room with drawn curtains, sipping bitter coffee from styrofoam cups. Rex lay by the door, his ears flicking at every faint noise outside. The dog's unease mirrored their own, a silent reminder of the tension that refused to fade. Ethan tapped his phone screen, trying to find information about similar UFO sightings in the area. There's nothing recent, he muttered, scrolling through outdated forum posts. It's like nobody's seen anything like this in years. But we saw it. We felt it. Lucas stared at the wall, his thoughts racing. What if that's the point? What if people did see it, but no one lived to tell the story? Or worse, no one believed them. Ethan looked up, frowning. That's a stretch, even for you. But he hesitated, the words catching in his throat. It doesn't feel right, does it? Like we're part of something we don't understand. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken fears. Finally, Lucas stood and paced the small space, his movements restless. We need to go back to the house, he said abruptly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Are you out of your mind? After what happened last night? We left everything there, Lucas argued. Our equipment, our notes, everything. If we just leave it all behind, then we're giving up. And you said it yourself. We need to understand what's happening. Rex let out a sharp bark, startling both men. His gaze was fixed on the window, where the blinds were slightly ajar. Lucas moved cautiously toward the glass and peered out. The parking lot was empty, save for a few cars, but something felt off. The air seemed charged, like the static before a thunderstorm. I don't see anything, Lucas said, though his voice wavered. Ethan stood, his posture tense. Maybe we should wait until tonight, when it's darker. If they're still watching, it'll be easier to avoid them in the shadows. Lucas shook his head. No, if we wait, we'll lose our nerve. We go now, while there's daylight. Reluctantly, Ethan agreed. They packed what little they had into their car and left the motel, the tension thick between them. As they drove back toward the house, the landscape grew more familiar, yet somehow more alien. The trees lining the road seemed taller, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The air grew colder, and Rex whimpered softly from the back seat. Almost there, Ethan said, his voice hollow. When the house finally came into view, it looked the same as they had left it, quiet, unassuming, and eerily normal. Yet both men felt the weight of the previous night pressing down on them, a heavy reminder that appearances could be deceiving. Lucas parked the car and turned off the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, neither wanting to make the first move. Finally, Ethan spoke. Let's grab our stuff and get out as fast as we can. Lucas nodded. No distractions, in and out. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Rex stayed close, his tail low and his ears perked. The house loomed before them, its windows dark and reflective, like empty eyes. As they approached the front door, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching from within. They entered cautiously, the familiar creak of the floorboards sounding louder than usual. The house felt colder than it should, and the silence was oppressive. I'll check upstairs, Lucas whispered. Ethan nodded, heading toward the kitchen to retrieve their notes. As Lucas climbed the stairs, Rex remained at the base, growling softly. Lucas glanced back, his heart pounding. "It's okay, boy," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. But deep down, he knew it wasn't okay. Not by a long shot. Lucas's footsteps echoed faintly on the wooden staircase as he ascended. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, reverberating in the unsettling silence. He gripped the banister tightly, his pulse hammering in his ears. Rex stayed at the base of the stairs, his low growl a constant reminder that they weren't truly alone. Lucas paused midway up, glancing over his shoulder. The dog's eyes were fixed on the upper landing, hackles raised. "Stay there, Rex," Lucas whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring, the dog or himself. The hallway at the top was dark, the weak daylight filtering through grimy windows barely illuminating the space. Lucas hesitated, his gaze darting to the open doors of the bedrooms. He knew where their equipment was stored, in the small office at the end of the hall. As he moved, the air grew heavier, thick with an unexplainable charge. It felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Lucas reached the office door and pushed it open, his hand trembling slightly. The room was just as they had left it. Their notebooks, cameras, and other gear were scattered across the desk and floor. Lucas stepped inside, exhaling a shaky breath. "Almost done," he muttered to himself, reaching for the nearest notebook. Downstairs, Ethan was busy rummaging through the kitchen, collecting papers they had spread across the counter during their initial investigation. The silence pressed down on him, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers. He glanced toward the living room, where the front door stood slightly ajar. "Lucas, you okay up there?" he called out. "Yeah, just grabbing the stuff," Lucas's voice echoed faintly in response. Ethan turned back to his task, but something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. A shadow that seemed to move, even though nothing else in the room stirred. He froze, his grip tightening on the stack of papers in his hand. The shadow lingered just beyond the doorway to the living room, shifting slightly, as though alive. "Lucas?" Ethan's voice wavered. "What?" Lucas called back, the sound of his footsteps descending the stairs following his reply. Before Ethan could respond, Rex let out a sharp bark from the bottom of the staircase. Lucas appeared moments later, arms full of their equipment, his expression tense. "What's wrong?" Lucas asked, glancing between Ethan and the dog. Ethan pointed toward the living room, his hand trembling. "There was something there. I swear it moved." Lucas followed his gaze, but the room appeared empty, the shadows still. "Let's not stick around to find out," Lucas said firmly. "We've got everything we need. Let's go." Ethan nodded, and they hurried toward the front door, Rex keeping close to their heels. But as they stepped outside, the air shifted. The oppressive stillness of the house followed them onto the porch, and the faint hum that had haunted them before returned. Lucas and Ethan exchanged a look, their unspoken fear clear in their eyes. They quickly loaded the equipment into the car and climbed inside, their movements rushed and frantic. As Lucas started the engine, Ethan glanced back toward the house. For a moment, he thought he saw something in the upstairs window, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. "Go," Ethan said urgently, his voice tight. "Just go." The car sped down the gravel driveway, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But the unease lingered, a weight neither of them could shake. "We're not coming back," Lucas said quietly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Ethan didn't argue. There was no point. Whatever secrets the house held, they were better left behind. The drive back to town was silent, except for the hum of the car engine. Lucas and Ethan sat in a shared tension, each too absorbed in their own thoughts to speak. Rex, lying across the back seat, whimpered occasionally, his ears pinned back. As they reached the edge of town, the bright lights and familiar sights brought a fleeting sense of relief. Yet, the ominous weight of their encounter lingered, refusing to be shaken off. Lucas pulled into a gas station, the need for fuel and a moment of reprieve compelling him to stop. "I'll fill the tank," Lucas muttered, stepping out into the cold night air. Ethan watched him through the windshield, his fingers drumming nervously on the dashboard. His mind replayed the shadow he'd seen in the house, the way it seemed to shift and pulse, as if alive. Inside the station, Ethan grabbed 2 bottles of water and a bag of snacks, hoping to distract himself. At the counter, the cashier, an older man with a weathered face, eyed him curiously. Late night? The man asked. Ethan hesitated. Something like that. The cashier nodded, ringing up the items. Out at the old house on Harper's Road, weren't you? Ethan froze, his blood running cold. How do you know that? Small town, the cashier said with a shrug. Word gets around when strangers start poking their noses where they don't belong. Ethan forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. We weren't poking around, just passing through. The man's gaze lingered on Ethan, his expression unreadable. Best to keep it that way. Some things out there aren't meant to be disturbed. Ethan hurried out of the store, his heart pounding. Lucas was leaning against the car, the tank full, watching the dark road ahead. You okay? Lucas asked as Ethan approached. Yeah, Ethan lied, handing him one of the water bottles. Let's just get back. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the silence between them was heavy. They returned to their motel, the small, sterile room offering a meager sense of safety. Lucas slumped onto the bed, exhausted, while Ethan sat by the window, staring out into the night. The town seemed quiet, ordinary, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. We need to figure out what's going on, Lucas said finally, his voice low. Ethan nodded. But not tonight. Let's just get some rest. They turned off the lights, loud, though sleep didn't come easily. The faint hum they had heard before seemed to echo in their ears, growing louder as the hours crept by. And as the clock ticked past midnight, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, an unnatural light that seemed to pulse, beckoning. Neither of them noticed it until the next morning, but by then it was too late. The events they had tried to leave behind were far from over. The next morning arrived with an eerie calm. The sky outside the motel window was overcast, casting the town in a dull gray light. Lucas and Ethan sat at a small table in the corner of the room, the remnants of a rushed breakfast between them. We can't just leave this alone, Lucas said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Ethan shook his head. And do what? Go back out there? Look for more? Signs? Before Lucas could respond, Rex barked sharply, startling them both. The dog was standing near the door, his hackles raised. What's gotten into him now? Lucas muttered, walking over to calm the dog. But when he opened the door to look outside, he froze. The horizon, faintly visible between the buildings, glowed with an otherworldly light. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably unnatural. Is that? Ethan joined him at the doorway, reckoning, his face paling as he took in the sight. Same as before, Lucas said grimly. It's the same light. Ethan closed the door, his hands trembling. Why is it still here? We left the house. We left everything behind. Maybe it's not about the house, Lucas said, pacing. Maybe it's the area, or us. They sat in silence, the implications of Lucas's words sinking in. Rex whined softly, his tail tucked between his legs. After a long pause, Ethan spoke. If this thing isn't tied to the house, it means it's still out there, watching. Waiting. Lucas nodded. And we're not going to get any peace until we figure out why. Reluctantly, they decided to drive back to the area where they had first encountered the light. Not to the house itself. They weren't ready for that, but close enough to observe from a distance. As they left the motel, the glow on the horizon grew stronger, as if guiding them. The quiet streets of the town felt oppressive, and the further they drove, the heavier the air seemed to become. When they reached a hill overlooking the forest near the house, Lucas parked the car and cut the engine. The light pulsed faintly in the distance, just beyond the treetops. This is as far as we go, Ethan said firmly, his voice barely above a whisper. They sat in the car, watching the glow. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the unease in the air seemed to grow thicker. Then, without warning, the light vanished. Did you see that? Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. Yeah, Lucas said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Rex growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the forest below. And then they saw it, a shadow moving through the trees. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shape that defied logic, shifting and bending in ways no living thing should. We need to go, Ethan said urgently. But Lucas didn't move, his eyes locked on the figure. Lucas! Ethan shouted, snapping him out of his trance. They drove away in a frenzy, the oppressive weight lifting only as they reached the outskirts of town. Neither of them spoke as they returned to the motel, but they both knew that the mystery wasn't over, and whatever was out there wasn't going to let them leave so easily. Lucas, Ethan, and Clara sat in Lucas's living room, the glow of the television illuminating their exhausted faces. The local news reported a meteorological anomaly over their town, dismissing the strange lights as weather phenomena. The three exchanged knowing glances. They had seen too much to believe such an explanation. The town had returned to normal, at least on the surface. The animal disturbances had stopped, and the eerie hum no longer filled the night air. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Yet, none of them could shake the feeling that they had been watched, studied. Ethan opened his laptop, scouring forums and conspiracy websites, trying to find any mention of similar experiences. But there was nothing. No reports, no news articles, no government statements. It was as if the entire incident had been erased. Clara sighed. Maybe we should stop looking. If someone or something wanted this covered up, maybe it's best we don't dig any deeper. Lucas leaned back, rubbing his temples. But what if it happens again? What if we were just lucky this time? Silence settled between them. They all knew the truth. The strange lights, the eerie encounters, the feeling of being watched. It was real. But without proof, they were just another group of people with a story no one would believe. As they left for the night, Ethan hesitated at the door. If they come back, he began, but he didn't finish the sentence. Lucas gave a small nod. We'll be ready. Outside, the sky was clear. No lights, no hum, just the vast empty darkness stretching into the unknown. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.